So in this video, we're going to talk about three cardiomyopathies. The first one's dilated cardiomyopathy. So with this one, we have dilation in all four chambers of the heart. And in this form, there's eccentric hypertrophy versus a concentric hypertrophy, which we'll see later. So for eccentric hypertrophy, this is kind of what it looks like. So if this was the normal heart muscle with a certain thickness layer. Eccentric, that's normal. And then eccentric just means the layers kind of line up like this. So it's much longer, but it's thinner, right? And so that'll change the function, how well the heart functions. And so what we'll see, let me erase this. Okay, so if all four chambers of the heart are dilated, what are we going to see next? Well, we're going to have decreased ejection fraction. So that's going to cause systolic problems, right? So the heart will fill fine because the chambers are dilated, so the blood can go into the heart no problem. But since the muscle fibers are so long and they're not thick enough, then they're over compliant, and they won't be able to squeeze the blood out of the heart, and so that'll cause, over time, it can cause heart failure, right? Because the blood's not pumping, it's not getting to the rest of your body. And so this is what it looks like. On the right, we have the normal heart, and you can see the thickness of the septum, and this is the left ventricle here. And so the muscle wall is very thick. But then if you look at the dilated on the left, you'll see all the space in the ventricles. And so again, the blood will fill fine, right? But if this tries to squeeze out, you're not going to have that much blood getting squeezed out. And so that's the problem we have. And so grossly, this is what you would see. Remember, it just looks like a balloon that's been blown up, right? It's very dilated. And so this can be caused by a few things. So mainly it's ages 20 to 50 that get it. It can have some genetic causes. It's usually, it's about 50-50. Half the time it's genetic plus something. So in this case, alcohol or drugs like cocaine or doxorubicin. Some viruses like Coxsackie B and enteroviruses can cause it, and Chagas disease. And so the way you can remember this is, it looks like on the left, it looks like the muscle has atrophied, right? Like compared to the normal. And so commonly alcohol and drugs, which are toxic, they have toxic components to them, damages the muscle of the heart, causing the atrophy. And again, if you have an infection or anything like that, that can also cause damage to the muscle fibers, leading to atrophy and leading to this dilated heart. And so, again, the risks with this, you can have arrhythmias, you can have thrombi forming in the ventricles, leading to pieces getting broken off and an embolus sent to the brain or wherever, and that can cause sudden death. And so the 5-year survival rate is 25%, and at this point, the patient would need a heart transplant. Okay, so in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, hypertrophic just means the heart muscle wall is getting much thicker. So it's kind of the opposite of what we saw in dilated cardiomyopathy. And so specifically, there's an asymmetric hypertrophy of the left ventricle with the septum. So the septum is actually thicker than the ventricle. And so just by a little bit. And this is, again, concentric. So concentric meaning, if this was the normal, concentric just means the muscle fibers are now arranged like this. And so it's much thicker. The wall itself is thicker compared to the normal. Okay, so let's erase that. Okay, so then, well, if we get a much thicker wall, what does that mean? Well, that means that the ventricle can't fill if it's really thick, right? So you have a reduced preload. So if the ventricle can't fill, then it's also going to have problems, squeezing it out, because it's going to, not that much blood is being filled into the ventricle in the first place. So you're not going to squeeze that much out. And so that can lead to, many problems, of course. And subaortic stenosis is one of those. And so this is when the ventricle is trying to left ventricle is trying to squeeze into the into the aorta, but it can't because of how thick the walls become. It's stenosed the valve, and so that would cause an increased afterload. So it'd be really hard to push the blood into from the ventricle into the aorta. And so this is a really great picture. So you can see that the septum has thickened, and this is actually the left ventricle on the left here. And so you can see this is actually thicker than the left ventricle. And so that's when they say asymmetric hypertrophy. That's what they mean, that both have hypertrophied, but the septum is a little thicker. All right. And so this is just another view. You can see the ventricle is like completely collapsed, and it's not, you're not going to get anything flowing there. And so on microscopy, you're going to have this myofiber disarray. And so you can see how it's kind of all, these are the myocytes, and they're all just kind of, disarrayed, right? So most common causes are genetic. It can also be idiopathic, but mostly are genetic. The most important ones to know are the beta myosin heavy chain and myosin protein binding protein C, are the most common causes of that. And so this commonly affects young athletes. So you'll see that athlete will come in for a physical, and they might have they're either normal or they're going to have some kind of problem, right? So if they do have a problem, you might hear like a murmur or something, and they'll have to get checked out, and they might have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or they could be in the middle of a game and they could just collapse, not knowing that they have this condition, and so that can be very dangerous. And so, if the heart walls are thickened, and it's going to have problems filling, and so you're going to have a reduced stroke volume, and so that's why they collapse. They can even die. And so they'll complain of chest pain because this wall is thickened so much that it's going to require more oxygen and more blood flow. And so that increased demand is what causes their chest pain. And you're going to have an S4 systolic murmur, because remember, an S4 is when you have the atria that are trying to contract into these thickened, non-compliant ventricles. And so you can have atrial fibrillation because the atria are trying to contract and they can't, and so they'll start freaking out. You can have thrombi and embolus that forms, and again, this can cause stroke and arrhythmias. So for restrictive cardiomyopathy, this one's a little different than the others. This one is just simply a buildup of substance. So some kind of substance caused by some disease. You're not changing the heart size. You're not, you're not changing the shape necessarily of the heart. You're just adding something because of a disease. You have a buildup in the heart muscle fibers. And so because you have that buildup in the muscle fibers, it's going to cause the ventricles to become non-compliant or less compliant. And so that's going to cause a bunch of filling problems or diastolic problems. So if you can't fill the ventricles, well then, if the heart muscles are non-compliant, then you're going to have heart failure, arrhythmia, sudden death. All these cardiomyopathies kind of end up like that if they're not treated. And so here's kind of a picture. So if this is the left ventricle here, you can see that it's very diseased and there's some kind of buildup, some problem there. And that's really all it is. And so this is a picture of something that can build up. This is amyloid. So all these are the myocytes here. And then in between, you see this like pink material here. So this is all amyloid. This is all amyloid. All this is amyloid built up into the muscle fibers, into the myocytes, causing the decreased compliance of the ventricles, diastolic problems. Right. So again, the atria are enlarged because they have a little bit higher pressure because they're trying to squeeze into this less compliant ventricle. But the ventricles are normal size because, again, the myocyte fibers haven't rearranged themselves or anything. They've just had some deposition of some kind of substance. And so let's talk about the substances, right? So there's a bunch of them. There's amyloidosis, which we talked about here. It's just buildup of amyloid. There's sarcoidosis, which is the non-caseating granulomas that form. So that granulomatous inflammation can cause damage to the myocytes. There's hemochromatosis, there's fibroelastosis, Loeffler syndrome, which is eosinophilic infiltrate into the myocytes. And so again, you don't really have to remember these specifically. You can just remember that any kind of buildup caused by these diseases will cause a restrictive cardiomyopathy. If you're given the option between restrictive and hypertrophic and dilated cardiomyopathy, you'll know that if a patient has the disease that causes a buildup of, anything, it's most likely going to cause a restrictive cardiomyopathy. And so that's all I have for you. I hope that was helpful.